Friends, good day to everyone. Last year, almost a year ago, we had a recording with Viktor Ivanovich Galko, a candidate of economic sciences and the president of the Workers' Academy Foundation. It caused a sensation. It sparked huge interest, and a year later we met again. Hello, Viktor Ivanovich.
Good day, Katerina. Hello, dear comrades.
Today, I would like to talk about something that has been discussed incessantly in all the media for a year, in the specialized literature on demography. Viktor Ivanovich, why should Russia increase its demography at all?
The question seems somewhat strange to me. In general, I will answer this question with another question. Is humanity developing or self-destructing?
Well, it might be qualitatively developing, but quantitatively.
What do you mean by qualitatively? I think it is developing. And in this lies the positivity and optimism of life and the development of humanity. That's on one hand. On the other hand, let's take 25 years. What was the population of the Earth in 2000? About 6 billion. In less than a quarter of a century, almost 8 billion. After all, the huge population growth, people on Earth don't ask these theorists, and those who give some estimates, they develop. Meaning, they are optimists, and I suggest we follow them too. That's on one hand. On the other hand, there is a problem, of course, and it's good that you understand this issue, because for me, as they say, the truth is one and we need to reach it. It's difficult to find these grains of truth, and it's related to the fact that humanity develops and lives, produces and reproduces immediate life, not in a vacuum, not in some imaginary conditions, but in specific social conditions. And we have two systems, socialism and capitalism. Socialism and capitalism, yes, exactly right. This social form, or those social relations under which this process takes place, are determining. That is, they are the foundation, they are fundamental. That is, there are many factors such as ecology influences, as well as history, national relations, biological factors, and so on and so on and so on. But still, the foundation is economic relations, so it's one thing when production, the economy, is determined by the goal of ensuring the complete well-being and free comprehensive development of all members of society. And the efforts of the state, accordingly, all institutions are directed towards this. And it's a completely different matter when the goal of production is what?
Maximization of profit.
Profit, or the self-expansion of capital itself. After all, what kind of society, what system do we have in Russia now? Capitalism. Therefore, the goal is the production of profit, or, to put it more precisely, more elaborately, the self-expansion of capital, that is, capital itself. Let's answer this question. What does capital need for its self-expansion?
Well, at the very least, it needs workers.
Exactly right. But that's indirectly. In order to generate profit and to accumulate capital, it first needs a certain amount of working population. That's one. Secondly, since we're talking about accumulation, that is, expansion, it needs an additional amount of working population. And thirdly, as we also know, there must be a so-called reserve army of labor. That is, an additional number of workers who stand outside the gates and motivate those who are working to work harder, to turn the machine faster, and so on. That's basically it, but this is just one side of the process. I might have emphasized one process. In reality, we know that everything in nature and society is contradictory, and we need to consider other trends. That is, this process is taking place. In what way? Opposing trends are at work. And we see this, we know this. Well, as the simplest example, it's the cyclicality of capitalist production. But when there is an upswing, what does capital do? It attracts an additional number of workers, the working population. And when there is a crisis, it pushes away, throwing people out through the factory gates. Accordingly, these are the determining factors in the production and reproduction of immediate life. Well, on the other hand, I still kind of emphasize one side than the other. After all, capitalism is also a certain form of development of productive forces and production as a whole, including the form of production and reproduction of immediate life. There is a higher form of capitalism, where state monopoly regulates economic and social life. And there are some archaic, old, antediluvian forms of capitalism in free competition. This is also an important factor. I will present two figures and ask a very simple question. Let's take Russia, say, in the 1980s, when it was called the RSFSR. Well, we know that, for example, there is such a concept as natural increase, which consists of birth rate minus mortality, and migration increase is also taken into account. So I draw attention to the mortality rates. The 1980s, or the 1990s, 1,650,000 people. And the 1980s, somewhere at this level. This is from all types of deaths. from diseases, from accidents, from traffic incidents, and so on and so forth. Then came 1991, a sharp leap, 2,200,000. And throughout the 1990s and subsequent years, that's approximately the order of numbers.
A leap of all leaps, yes.
Yes. That is, for some reason, suddenly in Russia, now Russia, in the Russian Federation, mortality increased by an average of 600,000. Question: what happened in our country? I looked, it seems there were no catastrophes, no earthquakes, no meteorites fell.
They will tell you it's urbanization.
No, the answer lies in another area. There was a change in the social system. This is precisely the watershed. I would like to point out that in the 1980s there was socialism, not a full-fledged one, but rather a transitional, a crumbling one. So, not full-fledged socialism, but I will put this word in quotes. And even then it produced such results. It was replaced by capitalism. And that's how it is. This is the answer in the most general form. So, let's return to the theoretical formulation of the question, which we outlined at the beginning. That is, capital needs a certain amount of working population. So what kind of capitalism did we get? Advanced? Developed? Backward?
Well, peripheral, that fits here.
Not peripheral, but backward. With outdated, archaic forms of management. Socialism was a single monopoly aimed at serving the entire people, the whole society. The capitalism that came to the country first destroyed this single monopoly and continued to dismantle production and so on. Let's take a small example. Some small town, deep in Russia, there was a factory that supported the population of this town. The factory was destroyed. What followed after that? They destroyed the social sphere and brought in vodka. That's it, there you go. What will happen to the population of this town? Yes, nothing, just a cemetery. Well, maybe it's not good that these are negative aspects of mortality, but they are illustrative. How to explain? So, modern bourgeois statistics apparently received a task to somehow twist and explain. Well, what happened? Or not? Of course. It's even interesting. Of course, I'll go. So there is the concept of mortality. Mortality exists in all countries. And in Russia, there is mortality. But in Russia, during these years, these decades, there's excess mortality. It sounds nice, sort of. So why? What did they say? And then they start talking about those factors that are now full in the mass media, and the demographic bit, and so on and so on and so on. Probably after the Great Patriotic War, of course. A decline in birth rates. But that's a separate topic. There was such a factor in the discussion. Although, if we look at the factors of mortality, they are by all criteria, meaning increased mortality from diseases. But what does this indicate? But there was a process, meaning not only was production destroyed, but the social sphere was also destroyed, such as healthcare, leading to increased mortality from accidents. But what does this indicate? And here about nuts and so on, but this is probably just one side of the coin. Let's look at other factors that reflected this situation. Well, for example, an interesting survey was conducted of the All-Russian Public Opinion Research Center. It was published quite recently, in February. And suddenly it turns out that despite what is said about quality of life, urbanization and so on, over the last decades, the proportion of large families in Russia has almost doubled. Interesting. And secondly, when they survey...
And since when has it doubled?
Over the last decades.
Decades.
Decades. Russians of reproductive age 18 to 45 years show a trend where having many children is perceived as the ideal family model. The ideal family model. That is, it's a surprising thing. Russians, in general, still want to have large families and to have many children. A large family is considered to be from 3 people and more, right? Yes. So we move on to the issue of birth rates. So going back, there must be social conditions. But first of all, based on a certain economic basis, economic foundation, let's put ourselves in the place of families who want to have 3 or more children. So what should there be? A certain set of social conditions. B, free time and in. A certain level of salary. In my opinion, very simple questions. So let's see, what is sociality? Well, the very first thing is probably housing. There are probably such heroes who have 3 or more children and live in 15 square meters. But these are rare cases, and probably that wasn't our situation.
That's already prosperous. That's already yes, it says.
Again, I'll give an example. Russia in the 1980s, I repeat, this is not an ideal. It was already a crumbling socialism. So in the year 1990, according to our statistics, Russian, modern, the number of families who received housing and improved their living conditions was 1,300,000. Got that, right?
Uh-huh. Yes.
In the following years now, how many such families? 100,000 plus 90,000, 95, 110. That is 15 times less. Well, what kind of discussion can we have then? How can we talk about any kind of mass phenomena? No, of course not. So what option do we have left? Take a loan? A mortgage. Take a mortgage. There is the concept of normal conditions. Normal, let's say. From the historical components point of view, the requirements we have now. Well, let's say for a family with a husband, wife, and 3 children, what would be a normal apartment? The minimum? Well, 4 rooms. Well, 3. Okay.
3 is the minimum. Absolutely. I agree.
In general, it should be based on... Remember, plus for a human...
Well, even 4 without a special living room just to have...
Well, let's take a 3-room apartment for calculation, 75 square meters. So, the standard cost of housing is now 107,000 per square meter. We will calculate the so-called cost price. A 3-room apartment will cost 8 million rubles.
It also depends on the city. In Moscow, you can't buy for that price.
We're taking the standard. We won't consider Moscow.
That's AVG.
Yes, yes. The standard, meaning the cost price. This is without markup, without the profit that construction companies make. Then we'll propose a loan for 20 years. So, 8 million divided by 20 divided by 12 comes out to about 33,000 rubles per month. This covers the principal debt plus interest. We have so-called preferential interest rates. 6% or 8. So it adds another 40,000-50,000. It turns out to be 70,000-80,000 to pay for the apartment. What is our average salary?
Yes. Moreover, it's very interesting to look at this by region because, for example, you look at the median salary in a region and then the price per square meter in that region. And you compare them, and in almost no city are these figures comparable. I just conducted such an experiment and observed the results. And at the same time, you have to understand that if you have a large family, meaning 3 children, and the mother as a result stays with these children, at least she definitely cannot work a full-time job. This means that one person essentially has to provide for all of this.
Of course. Well, the average salary. Rosstat reported that it exceeded 100,000 rubles. Well, of course, that's gross. Subtract 13% and we end up somewhere around 80, how much? 87,000. So, you have to give the salary of one family member working to pay off the loan. And what about the rest? That is, it's impossible. So there is only one way. If we say that our society, even if capitalist is developing, it is concerned with ensuring that the population of Russia does not decrease. And that Russia does not die out, but develops. So it must address these issues. Why are you smiling like that?
I want to tell you another story from life about these preferential mortgages. I meet with my friend, she's a realtor herself, and she says, this past year, there was a preferential mortgage, all of it. And she says, I took a preferential mortgage for myself. She has one apartment, another. I took it. She says, well, now it will be completed in a couple of months. I'll rent it out, and with this one. With the money that the tenants will pay me, I will pay off the mortgage. In a few years, I will have my own apartment, and I will have practically invested nothing into it. I talk about this on Telegram, and people start commenting that yes, indeed. It turns out that those who already have housing are the ones using this preferential mortgage. Because if you need to take a preferential mortgage with children for a primary residence, what do you need to do? Rent an apartment, pay for it, pay off this mortgage, and do renovations there. Well, whether it's renovations or not, in general it's an unaffordable amount for a family. And it's a completely different matter if you already have a place to live and additional housing. Therefore, these preferential mortgages are mainly not for those truly in need, addressing this issue, but for those who already have some means of living.
I think this is an additional factor indicating that it contradicts the internal trend. As they say, they are sitting, but I'm taking a broader view. Let's assume the bourgeois state has set a task, and such a task has been formally set, to increase the population of Russia. Well, I wanted to say this later. So, let's return to this beginning. This is a big, complex task. We have only highlighted a few key points. So, our state, to solve this problem, must approve a plan. Some kind of plan. Well, how can you do without a plan? A huge country, large, in the economy, everything is interconnected. And the solutions to social issues must also be integrated into this system of tasks. Last year, we discussed such a plan with you. I will remind you briefly of the history. that a federal law on strategic planning has been adopted in the country. No, on the strategic planning of the Russian Federation, which kind of obliges us to make such a plan. But we had problems with the plans. But finally, a plan was adopted.
Our plans are more like suggestions rather than mandatory for execution.
Here, I'll show you. The Unified Plan for Achieving the National Development Goals of the Russian Federation for the period up to 2024 and for the planned period up to 2030. It was adopted in 2021. We briefly reviewed it. I remind you, the historian, by the name everything is wonderful. It's about a plan that is a system in the zone of assigned tasks. The task is mandatory to meet the requirements. So everything is fine. It's over 200 pages. There is a system of indicators. And the first indicators of this plan, the state, that is the population size of Russia. And it provided for a reduction in population size. Well, how can one talk about, in the goals of the development of the Russian Federation, talking about the population decreasing? So we criticized it back then. I think there were others who pointed it out, maybe on their own. Changes were made to this plan. And another plan was developed which, no, don't laugh, this is serious work, which is now called the Unified Plan for Achieving the National Development Goals of the Russian Federation until 2030 and for the perspective until 2036.
And I'm not laughing at the plan itself, but at the fact that experience. Planning in our country in recent years shows that on paper, scientists and specialists write everything correctly and everything is great. They demonstrate competent tools that should be used to achieve all this. But when we reach 2030 or 2036, for some reason we end up with, oh.
Yes, there is such a moment and it is very important. But I'll finish my thought. The plan was approved this year. When I saw it, I opened it and thought, well, finally. Maybe they have fixed the situation with the fact that our population is decreasing. No, in the preamble it is stated, I will quote, due to objective demographic trends. In the coming years, the population of the Russian Federation will be decreasing. What trends exactly? I don't know what trends they indicated, but the development plan, again, I emphasize this thought, the plan is called On Achieving National Development Goals, and it already includes a decrease in the population of Russia. So how can it be called a development plan?
Or maybe this is indeed what development consists of, that we have robotization, we don't need additional workers, let the population decrease, and the economy will grow. What do you think about that?
Let's go back. Every socio-economic formation, including capitalism, has its own law of population. And again, what is the main thing? What do we base it on? From the goal of capitalist production. This very profit, this very surplus profit for capital accumulation. Who produces it? The working population, and it by producing. These very means for achieving accumulation also produce the means that lead to its reduction, this very working population. You noted correctly, it's not robotization, but there is a general trend of development, of scientific and technological progress, which is expressed in the growth of labor productivity. And in economic terms, there is such a concept in the growth of its organic composition, that is, when there is more and more technology and relatively fewer workers are discussed. So, it turns out that this very development of production, including capitalist, pushes workers to the sidelines. That is, for the needs of capital, yes, indeed the population is not needed. So, no one is surprised by the trend that, let's say, people are having fewer children, and that's it. Let's put a period on that. Or they don't want to have children. Yes, no. It is embedded in the very system of economic relations that the needs of capital do not require a large working population. That's the problem. But on the other hand, I repeat, well, look, some events have occurred in the country. A special military operation began, and suddenly it turned out that to produce shells, drones, UAVs, factories are needed. And factories need workers. So it has turned around again, so to speak. The opposite trend. And for workers, well, what does the population need? They need to be recruited into the army. Who is taken into the army? The same workers, other employees. And how to deal with this? Well, which country can at least numerically create a stronger, more powerful army? Well, where there is a larger population, of course, potentially. Well, there is such a trend. I will continue. Let's finish with social issues. That is, if a bourgeois state sees this problem and wants to solve it, then it must find money, resources. Where can it get them? Well, the same capitalist calculated how much it would cost to build 1 million apartments, how much is needed? 8 trillion rubles. The organization's profit last year amounted to, the previous year, 35 trillion rubles. And the prices starting from last year, they are still calculating, will be over 50 trillion rubles. Well, can a bourgeois state solve this problem and, let's say, transfer some money from the pockets of individual organizations, individual capitalists into a common pot? Probably it can. For this, there must be certain decisions and the willingness of the entire class of capitalists. Let's move on. I want to finish my thoughts regarding the increase in birth rates, large families, and so on. Social issues are one side. The second, there must be free time. But is a large family involved here? Should parents see and raise their children or not? It seems like a well-known truth. What about our free time? Free time is meant for development, not just to lie on the couch. Free time, it turns out, is achieved when working hours are reduced. And now we have an interesting contradictory trend developing. Let me remind you, according to the Labor Code, Article 91 of the Labor Code, the normal duration of the work week is considered to be no more than 40 hours. This is recorded in the Labor Code. That is, the law is mandatory for execution. Accordingly, if the work week exceeds 40 hours, then it will already be. But if up to 40 hours is normal, then over 40 hours will be, well, a violation. Abnormal. Let's call it that. It will be abnormal. And these 40 hours, they didn't just come out of someone's head. They were actually achieved through struggle, working over at least, count the end of the 19th century and the entire 20th century. That is, in Tsarist Russia, the workday was 1.5 hours. Then workers at individual factories. Under Vasya's order, they introduced an 8-hour workday, and then the Soviet government, as they say, established it by decree as an 8-hour workday. That's the situation. But if you work more, it's called overtime, which does not comply with the Labor Code. To date, there are restrictions on overtime work. It's no more than 2 days, 4 hours in a row. No more than 120 hours a year. And with the consent of the worker. But let's go back. What do the interests of capital demand? To gain small profits, to increase its self-growth. The simplest method is the so-called absolute surplus value, achieved by absolutely extending the working day. Therefore, it's no coincidence that some capitalists suggest ideas to us. Let's make a 60-hour work week, 60 hours a week with a 5-hour workday. How much does that come to? 12 hours a day. Can you imagine? That's more than it was before.
With a 5-day work week, right?
Yes, with a 5-day work week. More than in Tsarist Russia, the working day. There it was 11.5 hours. So, where are these individual representatives of capital trying to lead us?
To avoid paying overtime?
Well, yes, exactly. So how did events unfold for us? Further, in August 2022, the government adopted Decree number 1365. This is related to the special military operation and the shortage of labor. That in defense industry enterprises and those fulfilling state defense orders, the workday can now be extended by 4 hours without the worker's consent. The only restriction is that there must be at least 24 hours of rest once a week. Well, all right. And this is explained by the special military operation, meaning the situation Russia has found itself in. That is, it's a strict necessity. But now look, what proposals are coming from the capitalist camp? Is there such an association? The Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs? So, just recently they made a proposal to the government to remove this labor code provision that limits overtime work with 220 hours per year. Make it 240 hours. And moreover, this is not proposed by an individual capitalist, but by their political association. And the government approved it. So is it already accepted? Don't listen. This was a proposal from the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs. The government approved it. But at the level of the presidential administration, it stalled. They said, not yet. Come on, Valentina, 240 hours.
I don't even understand how much that is.
Divide by 4. How much does that make? 60. But if in months we have about 20, 21, 22 working days, then it turns out if this proposal is accepted, then at all other enterprises, workers can be additionally engaged for 3 months for 12 hours. That is a quarter of the entire year. So here you go, 12 hours. But of course, there's also a carrot with double pay. We will consider this separately. We'll review it. Let's return to our topic. What kind of normal family upbringing can we talk about if both the mother and father work 12-hour shifts? Their children won't see them.
What you just mentioned off camera apparently was about how families organize family clubs, gather together and put on plays for the children. What can we even talk about when the father is at work for 12 hours and the mother is overwhelmed with the children trying to manage everything?
If this proposal is implemented, what will happen to us? Well, immediately there will be an overstrain of forces, right? Try working 12 hours at a machine. Illnesses and ailments will arise, and various other negative phenomena.
Well, to relax. I can hardly imagine how, if not drinking. Well, seriously. You come in such an emotionally intense state, you're so exhausted, and you have only a few hours to shake it off. It seems like an obvious solution.
So, what to do in this situation? A recent meeting of the Russian Workers' Council in Nizhny Novgorod considered this issue, discussed it, and made the following decision. But it seems that for defense enterprises, there's no way out for now. We can't find any workers. So we have to work. What then? Well, to help somehow, from a medical standpoint, for example, obligate entrepreneurs to sign voluntary medical insurance contracts. Because in the government decree we talked about 1365, it's recommended. But what is a recommendation? A recommendation is something that can be followed or not followed. It's not a law and not a decree. That's the first thing. And second, well, to take some measures that is for the future, after the end of the word. Well, for example, to count this day in the chest of drawers as 2, or when calculating the pension. But that's already in the future. That is, in any case, the problem certainly exists now.
And it turns out that in this problem, overall, in resolving this issue, only one side is involved. The one that is interested in extending the workday, in intensifying this workday, and the other side which is interested in the opposite, in improving its own standing.
This is one side, let's say, the representatives of capital in 2 forms. That is, there are individual representatives and their public association, and there is, let's call it, the collective capitalist, which is the bourgeois state. So one side of the government approved it, and the other side there, the president's administration, not yet. Nothing stays in place, meaning it won't stop, and we'll find some resolution.
It seems to me that the resolution in such situations is usually like this. Let's extend it to 240 hours. No, not to 240, let's not extend it, okay, to 200.
That might be the case, but life will show. I completely agree with you. Of course, if there's no active struggle or opposition, it could take more than 240 hours. Anything is possible. So the third point, wages. Here's a family. Mother, father, and 3 children. What should the wages be? There is such a concept as the cost of labor. The cost of labor is a political economic concept. It characterizes the following, or it consists of the cost of those means of subsistence that are necessary for the normal functioning, the normal provision of life for the worker's family. And we consider, of course, 3 children. So, what is normal? Normal is from the perspective of the conditions that exist in our society. Now, from the perspective of history, the demands put forward by even the economy, the social sphere, and scientific and technological progress. If 100 years ago there were no mobile phones, then now it is probably a normal requirement for each family member to have one, and that they live not in some slums, barracks, dugouts, tents, but in normal apartments. Moreover, I agree with you. When calculating the cost of labor in our country, they usually consider a 3-room apartment for a family of 5. Probably it should be more. But in any case, the cost of labor, which is different from wages, is now at least 300,000 rubles. And I'm not including Moscow.
This is not Moscow.
Of course not Moscow. And St. Petersburg. And the main component there is the cost of housing. About this we talked about it, so I won't dwell on it. Well, let me take it. 30,000 rubles. This is what is called in the market.
Let's tell our colleagues where this comes from. Well, just try it yourself. Take an Excel spreadsheet and try to calculate. Let's say you take 25 years because you have the production of labor force, which is what you need to go to work yourself tomorrow and raise your children accordingly, 3 children. You take into account the mortgage, calculate the renovation at least once every 10 years, calculate the purchase of a car, also with some regularity. Every 5 years, how much it costs now. Purchase of household appliances, payment for some medical services, payment for universities. And everything you need up to buying, I don't know, bed linen and dishes. Communication, transportation, all of this you need to pay for. So take it, calculate, and you will be surprised that you end up with not 300,000, but much more. Because I calculated this for Moscow, and I got a much higher figure. I won't even mention it to avoid causing debates in the comments.
Yes, absolutely right. That is, the cost of labor and wages are related concepts, but they are different. So, once again, the cost of labor is the cost of living for a worker's family, for a normal existence, not some semi-starved, semi-poor existence. What is our average salary? As I already mentioned, Rostat triumphantly reported it reached 100,000 rubles. Well, let's subtract the income tax. The personal income tax, it comes out to somewhere around 87,000 rubles.
I'll look at the median.
Probably shouldn't take the median, the average. We know what the average temperature in the hospital means.
But the median, at least, shows more accurately, yes, this salary, above which half earn and below which half earn.
We need to take the wages of workers, those engaged in productive labor. It's quite difficult for our statistics to extract this now, but still, some remnants, traces remain. And the average wage of workers will be less than this very median.
Exactly 85, that is minus the income tax.
Even the wages of skilled workers will be lower across Russia, so let's put it on the scales. 300,000 is the minimum. We are not considering Moscow and St. Petersburg. And how much is the wage? 85. So what does it come to? 3 to 4 times less. So can we ensure a normal existence for a family? No, we cannot. So we return to overtime, to extra work. So according to the government decree, payment, that is according to the labor code, first 1.5 times more, then twice as much. According to the government decree, it's twice as much. So what does it come to? Twice as much as for those 4 hours. So you can't get much here. What to do? Are there any economic possibilities now to increase wages twofold or fourfold?
It's possible.
I agree with you.
But through technology. In terms of robotics, we are generally one of the last Arazova.
So there is a concept of the rate of surplus value. This is the ratio of surplus value to the cost of wages. Surplus labor relates to necessary labor. So according to the calculations of progressive scientists, Doctor of Economic Sciences Professor Viktor Georgievich Dolgov and Doctor of Economic Sciences Oleg Anatolievich Mazur, the rate of surplus value in Russia is 700%.
This means a worker works 40 minutes for themselves, the rest for...
Well, 40 minutes, yes. Let's even round it off so that it's clear and understandable. An hour for themselves is the maximum. And for 7 hours, they create surplus value which is appropriated by the worker. And for the capitalists, another 7 hours there and 1 hour here. If they were paid twice as much, due to some circumstances, achieved through collective actions, 2 for themselves, there's still more there. What is the rate of surplus value? 300%. This is also a colossal rate of surplus value. That is, today we have enterprises that are sufficiently developed in terms of labor productivity, meaning they have high labor productivity, where even a 4-fold increase in wages will not lead to any catastrophic consequences in terms of production profitability. We made this calculation for the Novorossiysk commercial seaport, so we end up with such exploitation, such an imbalance. Therefore, economically, there is an opportunity. And that's the first point. Secondly, I completely agree with you. That is, we need to compel the capitalist to achieve or obtain this very profit, surplus value, not through overexploitation or by extending the working day through overtime, but by increasing labor productivity. And a portion of the income obtained from the growth in labor productivity should be shared with the workers. But there's only one way to achieve this. Capitalists won't give it up on their own. This can only be achieved through collective actions. There are such examples. There aren't many, but they do exist. For instance, the dock workers' union. An example is the Vladivostok commercial seaport. Here, the dock workers at the St. Petersburg seaport. So let's return to the topic. It turns out that the situation is, of course, contradictory for us. On one hand, our Russian citizens, both men and women, want to have children, want to have and raise large families. On the other hand, there's this kind of capitalism that has developed, that is evolving, that is being established, which doesn't allow for that possibility.
Well, then I'll tell you, Viktor Ivanovich, there's this thesis that our population will decrease, and as a result of this decrease, we will all live better.
That's an interesting point. In this case, those who try to put forward such a thesis are somehow going against global progress. Well, let's take a look. I provided the figures. By how much has the Earth's population grown? By almost 2 billion, right? If we take the largest countries, by population, by volume, by industrial power. In all countries, to some extent, the population has increased, except for one. Guess with one try, which country is it?
I think in Europe it's also decreasing. There it's growing due to migration.
That country is Russia.
Really?
Yes. So we have a negative growth. Negative growth.
Migration doesn't cover it.
No. It's negative, though small, about 30,000. But considering, of course, the migration growth. If you remove the migration growth, then naturally it will be negative. So all the countries we take, for example, Germany, over these 23 years, data for the 23rd year, more than 2 million growth. The United Kingdom, almost 9 million. France, 6.5 million.
But for them, it's due to migration, due to birth rates.
Well, we are considering it as a whole. So correctly, the bourgeois state is conducting the policy.
But Grandma said it was 2.
I'm talking about the thesis that if the population decreases, then all the survivors will live better. There will be no one to work in the factories. This is simply refuted.
They do it very interestingly. They have many migrants. I'm not talking about all countries, but for example, if we take some Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, we will see that those who work for them, these are completely disenfranchised people whose passports are often taken away. Naturally, they work for pennies. And there are local residents who take advantage of all this.
Well, regarding migrants and migration policy, let's say, our thesis is very simple. It's equal rights for all migrants with the rights that, well, let's call them native residents have. I'll continue the thought about the fact that the population will decrease and the rest will live better. Last year, the Forum exhibition Russian Industrialist 2024 was held in St. Petersburg. And there the issue of labor shortage was raised. But a labor shortage also means we have a population shortage. And I was, so to speak, somewhat astonished that for several decades one policy was pursued. And here both the country and the bourgeois state were put in such conditions that forced them to, mildly speaking, reconsider everything, to look at it the other way around. An interesting statement from the leaders. So as long as we were importing planes, cars, medicines, and much more from abroad, a relatively small number of workers was sufficient, well, to perform maintenance. But after they started cutting off our oxygen with sanctions and the special military operation, a decision was forced to make everything necessary ourselves. Qualified workers became necessary in a completely different quantity and quality.
And quality?
Understood, but primarily in quantity. That is simply not there. But to have potential jobs, what is needed? Families need to have children, raise them first in kindergarten, then in school, then in college, and so on. And besides the shortage of workers, there is a shortage of engineers, and so on and so forth. And further on, the correct thoughts indicate what needs to be done. Look, let's return to the conversation we started. The capitalism that came and stood on its feet, stood out in the 90s, was not advanced or superior, but the kind of capitalism that destroyed what it came from, including in the area of training those same workers. Engineers, well, primarily workers, were left to drift at the mercy of market forces. Well, where's the money? Who did they start producing? Not worker engineers, economists, political scientists. No, economists, lawyers, accountants, political scientists, and public relations specialists.
In my time, when I was studying at the institute, at first we were all managers. That is, I don't know, it seems to me that 50% of everyone who studied were studying to be managers.
Well, those decades have passed. Strict conditions have been set. There's nowhere to go. They started to think, what should be done? Well, remember, by the way, the time that was, let's say, in the USSR, all these economists and political scientists were removed from all budget-funded positions. And now budget-funded positions will be allocated to those specialties that are necessary for pleasant productions. Both workers and, so to speak, engineers in universities.
Their secondary technical education is of great importance. And this particular link is severely damaged in our case.
Of course. I'll give a very simple example. In our city, there is a wonderful college, which for a long time was called the Banking College, for many years. But from the name, you could guess what kind of specialists it produced. Now it is called the College of Production Automation. And that's correct. That's good. That's correct. And it produces those specialists who are needed for production and high-performance labor. What other issues were raised there? So it was noted that people who graduate from either college or university are detached from production. They might need to be retrained, so to speak, re-educated. They recalled the experience of so-called technical universities, higher technical educational institutions, educational productions, workshops. And so far, the first and only such institution in St. Petersburg was created. Again, they recalled it was led by major enterprises, particularly the metro. But they, as a large monopoly, have their own metro college that produces specialists. But the numbers are such that, let's say out of thousands of graduates, only a few come to work for the metro. Suppose several 5, 10, 20 people ask what are they being trained for?
And where did the rest of them go, I wonder? The metro is an enterprise that is waiting for people.
This was acknowledged by the director of the metro. He raises the question of working for a certain number of years.
Zhenya Borisovich went to work in a cafe.
What kind of free society do we have?
Post-industrial Viktor Ivanovich.
We have capitalism, and capitalism is based on 3 principles: freedom, equality, brotherhood. You are free, you have a passport in your pocket, please go wherever you want. So these are the issues concerning workforce training. In other words, issues can be resolved, including by a bourgeois state within a capitalist society, which, as we have seen, both attracts and repels the working population. The question is only, well, yes, you need to apply political will, so to speak. And on the other hand, of course, you need to use advanced methods of regulating the economy, not those outdated, archaic ones that have reigned here for 2 or 3 decades.
Humanitarian policy.
Yes, including, of course, the policy implemented by the financial economic bloc, the so-called government.
So it turns out that our issues are not just about demographics, but about the demand for the population in the economy, basing it on the structure of the economy itself. That is, in order for more people to be in demand, for a more qualified workforce, for all of this to grow both qualitatively and quantitatively, the economy itself must develop first and foremost. Here we cannot rely on anything other than the goals, or rather the planning behind which certain goals stand. If we understand that we need to develop these industries in order to improve well-being and ensure the comprehensive development of the population, then we realize that we need advanced industries such as microelectronics, artificial intelligence, building rockets, many industries that need development, building airplanes.
Yes, I agree with you, I can say. In general terms, that capitalism, I repeat, is also a form of development of productive forces, higher than, say, the previous feudal formation. The only question is, and where it will further develop to its highest form using advanced methods within the framework of capitalism economic regulation. Or the ruling class will look back at what capitalism was 200 years ago and try to return there. But you can't go back there. If those methods are applied, it won't just be a gamble, it will lead to the destruction of the economy itself, the destruction of production. Well, what kind of demography can there be if the country is dying out?
And besides these internal problems, there is also the external world, which is developing by leaps and bounds. We look at China alone and see that it is surpassing its plans year after year, even those they set themselves. Next year, they are launching mass production of flying cars. What is there to talk about? And here we have these plans being set, which, let's face it, are unlikely to be fulfilled even in terms of industry, technology, and everything else.
Well, look at what the course of the official military operation has shown in terms of changes in the economy. First, we see an increase in production and a focus on real production. There's no other choice. The factories involved in the production of military goods are working 12-hour shifts, and in 3 shifts because there is no other way. And you see these demands decisions regarding the recruitment and training of skilled workers and necessary engineers. They stem from this. That's the first point. Second, some changes are occurring in the financial sector in a positive direction, and we discussed this last time. That is, if previously, as they say, a lot of money was going abroad and staying there, now a significant part has started to return. This is even with the sanctions in place. So where's the source of financing now? For the economy, for military production.
But they are settling in the banking sector.
No, it's all the same. The same, let's say, export operations, the export of oil and gas. That is, even under sanctions, the inflows are still coming. Here's the source of foreign currency inflows. Well, there are definitely changes in the training of personnel for the better. I mentioned this, I won't repeat myself. This is also important. So here you go, changes in terms of production development. Well, like the equipment, here's the financial source. Here are the personnel who solve the issues. And what's behind this? Well, at least a little. Demographics will follow. Even if you look, it seems like from TV screens, from the internet, they have started to talk a little about the necessity of family values, that it's important to have children and raise them. Here, for example, is the result of a SOM survey. I found it surprising.
LGBT was banned.
This is also important if you take it as a whole. So these are all links in one chain. But again, I repeat, even within capitalism, it's possible. Now let's return to another point. But there are limitations. And the limitations are imposed by capital itself and its needs.
Yes, by the contradictions that arise within the economy itself. Because you quite rightly mentioned that the interest, for example, of industrial capital, which is even indicated here in the resolutions or, well, I don't know, the media that publish the results of their congresses. So it's clear that industrial capitalists lack this workforce. There is currently a shortage in their sector. In other sectors, like sales, tabac, or among couriers, there is no such labor shortage. Similarly, there is no shortage in the banking sector. And it's clear that this group of capitalists will not be concerned about this issue.
Yes, but overall, this association, the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, supposedly represents the interests of everyone. Of the capitalist class, it is the largest and seemingly most significant association. It has put forward demands for, extending the working day.
Interestingly, even our industrial production, I won't name specific enterprises, but I think those who watch this will share their experiences. There are quite a few enterprises that, while claiming to be import substituting and having Russian production, actually bring everything from China, relabel it, and this isn't some malicious policy. It's just that you have no other choice because you simply can't sustain your profit. You can't produce here with the existing policies, various schemes, and competition with the same China. You can't produce a product here that you can sell and make a profit from. It's more profitable for you. That's the first thing. You are always calculating your profit. You are not calculating how to make things better. That's more of a byproduct in the goal of maximizing profit. But you look at how to make it more profitable for you. And if you have these loopholes and the opportunity to sell Chinese-made products with a Russian logo as Russian production, then you will do it. And that's what they do in most industries.
They take the easiest path. Well, that's understandable. Because for them, the goal is simply to gain more profit.
So it turns out that we understand the goals, we even understand the tools, and in general, there are not even any secrets about how to do it. And all the talk about how, no matter how much money you give people, we just have urbanization, and in a civilized society, no one is having children anymore. Here are the surveys from CIU. We see that society does not view this in the same way at all.
I think there are certain problems, and there are forces that are trying to portray these processes in the direction they need. And moreover, they are kind of skimming the surface. Maybe they understand, maybe they don't. It doesn't matter right now. But objectively, they are trying to hide the truth. That is, they are not addressing these economic contradictions that drive towards capitalist societies. And the problems facing specific Russian capitalism are clearly visible. And in their actions, that is, for almost 3 decades, they pursued one policy. And now, when life has placed them in opposite conditions, suddenly they start to turn 180 degrees. But in a positive direction. This is positive. Good, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Let them do so.
And still, regarding the issue of migration, I would like you to comment. In principle, do you see the problem of migrants, specifically, as these criminal groups and so on? How much do you see them in your real life?
So, the problem of migrants, I repeat, we see it differently. All migrants should receive the same rights as the native, let's call it that, of the population. If this does not happen, there will be all those problems that are written about, that exist, but which are sometimes blown out of proportion.
As far as I understand, the problems are not so much about rights, but rather that there are criminal schemes, which are being fought against. Yes, regarding the easy acquisition of citizenship. And people who come to Russia, often without even knowing the Russian language, tend to form groups and organize some criminal communities. This is often talked about, and they say that they pull in their own and cover for them. And these crimes, how do you feel about this?
And among the native population, there are no criminal groups engaged in their illegal activities. They exist too. That's one side. I don't think that on the part of migrants there is significantly more crime. That's not the problem. I repeat once again. The problem is that they come here. They are called migrants. That is, the movement of labor in a country under capitalism is kind of a normal phenomenon. They end up here in worse conditions. They are initially placed in worse conditions. And you expect something from them? Put them in equal conditions, and it will be completely different. If you put a person in worse conditions in all respects from the start, you will get a corresponding response. An increase in crime and various criminal schemes and so on and so forth.
I agree with you. Yes, I agree. Let's summarize.
Let's do that. I think these democratic issues certainly exist in Russia, and you have rightly brought them up. They are quite glaring. But to solve them, we need to dig deeper, because all these problems have a social form, or to put it another way, they occur within certain social relations, and these relations are capitalist. They are contradictory, they are based on the opposition, the antagonistic opposition of two classes, and within this opposition they will continue to develop in this way. That is, an antagonistic opposition is one that is irresolvable, but in any contradiction besides conflict there is a moment of unity. And this moment of unity allows for certain issues to be resolved over a short historical period. Since right now, after all, there is a great and terrible danger that needs to be resolved during the special military operation.
Let's hope that this problem will be resolved, and next time we can talk about something a bit more positive. Thank you very much, Viktor Ivanovich.
Thank you.
Thank you, comrades. Subscribe to all the channels. And don't forget that this project exists only thanks to you. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.